want to harden and stop the heart of our democracy. We are being called, like our foremothers and fathers, to be the moral defibrillators of our time.
Love is here, hope is here, truth is here, we are the change. Love is here, hope is here, truth is here, we are the change. Love is here, hope is here, truth is here, we are the change.
So it feels very important to me to say we need a real, serious conversation in this country, led by those that are most impacted. And I love this question of, does the Bible say anything about what nations, what Caesars are supposed to do? Because Matthew 25 says, I was hungry to the nations, not to a church, not to a charity, not to an individual. I was hungry. And what did your nation do?
Third Reconstruction, a moral revolution. Together we can be the hope and the solution. Third Reconstruction, expand democracy, a moral revolution. Reconstruction breaks us free. Third Reconstruction, a moral revolution. Together we can be the hope and the solution. Third Reconstruction, expand democracy, a moral revolution. Reconstruction breaks us free.
Because when we all get together, when we get love together, and equality together, and humanity together, when we all get together, what a day! What a day! What a day of justice it will be!
Together, what a day of justice that will be. When we all get together, what a day of justice that will be. When we all get together, what a day of justice that will be. When we all get together, what a day of justice that will be. Love is here, hope is here, truth is here, we are the change. Love is here, hope is here, truth is here, we are the change. When we all get together, what a day of justice that will be. When we all get together,
All get together.
what a day of justice that will be. When we all get together, what a day of justice that will be. When we all get together, what a day of justice that will be. When we all get together, what a day of justice
Hello to everybody joining us for this town hall of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, fighting for our rights, that will be hosted tonight by the Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris and attorney Rosalind Pellis. It is going to be a powerful night. My job tonight is simply to bring on one of the powerful leaders in our United States Congress. You know, this movement, it's not about what we feel should happen in America, but the Poor People's Campaign, the National Call for Moral Revival, knows that we have a right to demand cuts to the war economy and put more money into lifting the poor of this world. We know it's not a matter of scarcity of money or ideas, but a scarcity of moral conscience. We have a right to fight for fair taxes on the wealthy. We have a right to health care. We have a right to living wages. We have a right to just climate realities. We have a right to fully funded public education and our children's uplifting and protecting our teachers and college. We have a right to full, protected, and expanded voting rights. And we have a right to housing. We have a right, as Dr. King said, to fight. The right time to fight for right is right now. This country has declared that we have the right to protest and fight for right. We have a right to fight for our right to a Build Back Better plan as a step in the right direction towards the things that we ultimately need to do. We have a right to fight to promote the general welfare of all people and to ensure equal protection under the law. If it wasn't written on paper, we might not know it, but we have a right to do it. We have a right to declare to this nation, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their right and make women and children their prey. That's why right now, in the midst of even the fight for voting rights, to fight for Build Back Better, to fight for 15, we are already planning, because this is a long-term fight. We are mobilizing for June 18, 2022 for a national mass poor people's low-wage workers assembly and moral march on Washington. And we now have other countries that are saying people want to do it in their capital as well, because it will not just be a day of fellowship, but a declaration that we will have our human rights, we will have our constitutional rights, we will have our moral rights, because every one of us in every race and creed and color and sexuality and faith, and even those not of faith but who believe in the moral arc of the universe, we will non-violently fight for these things with love, with truth, and with justice on our side. We have a right to fight for what is right, and the right time for this nation to do right and to bring about a third Reconstruction and to lift from the bottom until everybody, poverty and low wages are eliminated. The right time to do it is right now. And the right leader of the Progressive Caucus, the right woman to be in this battle, because you can trust her in the private room and in the public room. The right one is that sister. Yes, I call her sister. I know I'm supposed to say Congresswoman, but that sister from way on the West Coast in the other Washington that is shaking the other Washington up, because it's time for a shakeup and people to lift from the bottom so that we can help the whole nation. There is a fighter in our midst. She was fighting before she got to Congress. She kicked it in another gear since she's been in Congress, and the Poor People's Campaign has her back in this moral fight, and that is none other than Congresswoman Jayapal. I want the Poor People's Campaign to welcome her tonight, for she is indeed not just a congresswoman, she's more than that. She is a warrior for the people, non-violently, but a warrior nonetheless. God bless you, and we love you, Congresswoman Jayapal.
So beautiful. Thank you so much, Reverend Barber. Thank you, Reverend Liz Theo Harris. Thank you, Poor People's Campaign. This is a movement that is fighting for justice, that is on the side of love and generosity and taking care of each other, but also on the side of fierceness. we're going to be fierce as we fight for what we deserve. And there is no one prouder than me to be standing with you, standing with my dear friend, my sister in the struggle, Barbara Lee, who I know is going to be on here as well. And the two of us together are so proud to be fighting for the third Reconstruction. That's why we introduced a bold and necessary and intersectional resolution that commits Congress to eradicating poverty. And it's why, as the chair of the 96-member strong Congressional Progressive Caucus, we are together fighting to implement these bold policies that center the poor, providing housing, health care, climate justice, equitable public education, voting rights, and yes, for all of this, making sure that people have the spiritual health, the moral health that they need to be able to make it through this really, really tough time. This conversation is happening at a pivotal moment in which millions of families are still struggling. Even as cases decline, the coronavirus pandemic and its devastating economic crisis have continued to leave too many with too little. And our current economic recovery is once again leaving behind working families and poor people. And it is pushing to the forefront, as has been the history in this country for too long, those who are already wealthy, those who are already making millions and billions, those who do not need to continue to make more, but do need to pay their fair share in taxes, because that is the investment that allows us to continue to make the investments in our poor people, in our working families across this country. Businesses are beginning to open up. Students are beginning to return to the classroom. The economy is beginning to improve. And some people have said we're returning to, quote, normal. But those of us that are here today know that normal has never worked for at least 140 million people who were poor, low wealth, or one emergency away from economic ruin long before this pandemic ever hit. So we cannot simply return to normal when normal meant the worst inequality since the Great Depression, when it meant the richest 130,000 families in America holding nearly as much wealth as the bottom 117 million families combined, when it meant 40% of Americans didn't even have $400 in their bank account for emergency expenses before the pandemic hit, and when it meant that billionaires are blasting themselves into space for fun while working families and poor people are struggling to keep food on the table or stay housed. So we can't go back to a normal that left 87 million people uninsured or underinsured across this country, a time when grandma sat at the dining room table cutting her pills in half, even though we spend more on prescription drugs in the United States of America than any other nation, all while we're paying more per capita for healthcare than any other country in the entire world, and we still have a third of our population that is uninsured or underinsured. We can't go back to normal when normal meant a horrifying epidemic of institutionalized racism, white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and police brutality that left a nation watching Black men and women die sleeping in their bedrooms, taking a walk, or under the knee of officers while crying, "I can't breathe." We can't go back to a normal that meant more than 45 million people holding $1.7 trillion in student loan debt, with 1 in 4 borrowers behind on payments, or a normal where 100 million Americans can't even find a playground or a green space within 10 minutes of their home, as Indigenous, Black, Brown, and low-income communities lack access to safe drinking water and clean air. A normal is not normal where more than 500,000 people were experiencing homelessness in the wealthiest nation on earth. So that's why what we're doing together is so important, because we gotta change this. We need a whole new normal where we actually refuse to allow poverty to exist. Because let's be clear, it only exists because we allow it to exist. In the wealthiest country in the world, 140 million people are poor because we have not ended that. And we have the power to end poverty. So that begins right now. It begins by passing President Biden's popular Build Back Better agenda. That is why the Progressive Caucus said we are going to hold the line. And we are not just going to deliver a much smaller infrastructure bill and not ensure that we deliver the entirety of the president's Build Back Better agenda. What is that agenda? That's universal child care for all families across the country. It's universal pre-K. It's making sure that we have paid family and medical leave. It's making sure that we have affordable housing, community college, climate action, real action on climate change, and a roadmap to citizenship for dreamers, TPS recipients, essential workers, and farm workers. It's making sure we have health care, because at the end of the day, we do not want to leave anybody behind. And here's the bottom line. These are investments that literally will change how people wake up in the morning. Ensure that single mothers can go to work without spending half of their paycheck on childcare, or that if you have a health emergency, you can get 12 weeks of paid leave without losing your job, or that if you're striving for an education, you can get one for free at your local community college. And on the tax side, it is making sure that the wealthiest pay their fair share. That's all. That generates trillions of dollars to pay for everything. So Reverend Barber is right that we don't suffer from scarcity in this country. We suffer from greed. And it's time to end that and to make sure that we fight for everyone. And that is what I am looking forward to doing with you, the Poor People's Campaign, with the brave people across this country that are in every state on the streets. This is not a short-term fight. This is a long-term fight, as Reverend Barber said, and we are in it for the long term, because we got to make short-term gains, and we will deliver. We will deliver transformative investments, but we're going to have to do more, because this kind of poverty in this country has been allowed to exist for too long. And we have to change the way people think about what is possible and what is not tolerable. So thank you so much for everything that you're doing. Thank you for backing us. Thank you for having our backs. We need it. And we are strong, and we are generous, we are loving, and we are fierce. So don't test that fierceness, because we are fierce and we're going to hold it together. Thank you so much.
Well, you know, love has a certain fierceness to it. Have you ever seen a mama bear protect her? Have you ever seen a mama fight for her children? Have you ever seen somebody, a brother fight for his sister if they really love each other? So fierceness is a part of love. It's just we choose to fight with our own weapons. We don't choose the weapons of meanness and lying and cheating and greed and those kinds of things. I want all of the people to know, because this is a town hall, a public town hall. You notice one thing, Poor People's Campaign, Congressman Jayapal never talked about being a Democrat. She talked about issues. She talked as a woman, as a stateswoman, and that's why we wanted her to come, because this is really not about so much Democrat versus Republican. It's about right versus wrong. It's not even about the Biden plan or the Manchin plan. It's about what side are you on when it comes to poor people and hurting people in this country, and we're clear about that. And anybody that's standing for that, we'll stand with them, regardless of their race, their creed, their color, their political affiliation. But if you're not, we have to challenge you, because for us and for the people in this campaign, as they say, our backs against the wall. We have no choice but to fight, because we had to fight before COVID ever hit. This is not, we didn't face this before COVID. It's just been further exacerbated during COVID. I saw today where billionaires have now made $2 trillion during COVID, while poor and low wealth workers have been the first to forced to go to work, the first to get sick, the first to get infected, the first to die. We call them essential workers, but now people who are blocking this plan are treating them like they're expendable. We can't sit down and be quiet on that. So two things as I close this part. Congresswoman Jayapal, we have had a group of women a few weeks ago. You weren't there because you had to be in Washington, but they're ready to do a major national press conference, even if it has to be online, with you and other members of the caucus,
to put a face on this. So if you want to, this week, before the end of the week, we're headed to West Virginia on Sunday. We'll have a mass rally at 4 o'clock with impacted people. And what we're going to be talking about is how this plan will affect West Virginia and how, if it doesn't get through, it will harm West Virginia. We don't have hatred for anybody, but we do hate poverty and we hate injustice. So we are willing between now and Friday to do, with online, to bring those sisters back. You be there. We invite the media, talk to them, and put a face on it.
Yes.
But keep fighting, keep standing. This is the season for stateswomen and statesmen. This is not the season for mere partisan conversation, because we have a crisis of civilization at hand. When you have attacks on the infrastructure of our democracy, which is voting rights, and the infrastructure of our daily lives, health care, education, living wages, climate, and then an attack on our infrastructure of our roads and bridges and technology, especially being placed in poor and low wealth communities, that's a threefold attack. A threefold attack that is not partisan as much as it is attack on the democracy and the soul of it itself. And if we don't take this step, we're not going to be able to take the other steps. So that's how we look at it. This is a step, but it's a necessary step if we're going to take the rest of the journey. We don't intend to turn back anytime. Now, between you and Liz, I'm easy getting along with. I'm a pushover. But between you and Liz Theo-Harris, they better watch out, because the fight is really on. And you add Barbara Lee to that, I would not face you off for nothing in the world. I just sit down and give up right now. God bless you.
Yes.
Take care. Forward together. Not one
Thank you
step
so
back.
much. Have a great evening. Bye.
It's powerful to be here with everybody. We have a beautiful panel of speakers and panelists, as well as impacted leaders from all across the country, who are going to be bringing forward some powerful questions. But right now we want to watch a video and have a song, and then we'll bring up our panel of speakers.
We came here today to talk about the intersection of economic justice and voting rights, and that you can't separate the two. We came here clear that in our Constitution it's never separated. It calls us to establish justice and to promote the general welfare. Those two pillars must always be held together.
We are witnessing the largest attack on our democracy since the first Reconstruction after the Civil War. And what we know is that attack on our democracy impacts the 140 million people who are poor, or one healthcare crisis, one job loss, one emergency away from economic ruin, by far the most.
I also came here and took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution, and every single day we make a pledge to the flag for liberty and justice for all. Justice is the overriding word here.
So thank you, Miss Pelosi, for listening to me, because my representatives aren't. That's the reason I'm in the streets, trying to get them to listen. We're hurting. We're scared, and I'm scared to death of the political insurrection I'm seeing in the states and in my halls of Congress.
We have elected officials that are fighting to suppress my vote, but are doing nothing for those of us who lost loved ones in our snowstorm.
My God, my God.
We have those who are trying to prevent us from having $15 a minimum wage, but are encouraging us to pay the energy companies that didn't provide energy during the snowstorm.
Yes, sir. That's it. Pass infrastructure that reaches to poor and low wealth community. Pass the Build Back Better plan, but do it all, not some of it. It can be done. This is the time. Madam Speaker, hold the line in the House, and we'll hold the line in the street.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my people? Which side are you on? Harriet Tubman was a freedom fighter. She taught me how to fight. We're gonna fight all day and night until we get it right. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my people? Which side are you on? Listen, Ella Baker was a freedom fighter. She taught me how to fight. We're gonna fight all day and night until we get it right. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my people? Which side are you on? Woo. John Lewis was a freedom fighter. He taught me how to fight. Yes, we're gonna fight all day and night until we get it right. Which side are you on? Oh, which side are you on? Help me. Which side are you on, my people? Which side are you on? I said a freedom. Dun, 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 dun. I said a freedom. Dun, 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 dun. I said a free ho, oh, oh, a dooba dooba dooba. Oh, 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 a dooba dooba dooba. I'm marching for freedom. Oh, I'm marching for freedom. Oh, I'm marching for freedom. Oh, I'm marching for. Which side are you on? Oh, which side are you on? Which side are you on, my people? Which side are you on? I got two more. Bishop Barber is a freedom fighter. He's teaching me how to fight. We're gonna fight all day and night until we get it right. Which side are you on? Oh, which side are you on? Which side are you on, my people? Which side are you on? Reverend Liz is a freedom fighter. She's teaching me how to fight. We're gonna fight all day and night until we get it right. Which side are you on? Oh, which side are you on? Which side are you on, my people? Which side are you on? I said freedom.
Thank you so much for being here at this Poor People's Campaign. It's time for a third Reconstruction Town Hall. Thanks again to Representative Jayapal and Reverend Dr. Barber for opening us up. The purpose of this town hall is to bring the attention of the nation to the need for a third Reconstruction. The need to take back economic, political, civil, and human rights, the legal gains that have been made over the past decades that have been stripped away because of immoral policies, because of direct acts of violence, because of the concentration of wealth, and so much more, and to come forward with our power, with bold advancements. So we're now in the section of our town hall where we have leading economists, faith leaders, activists, policy people who are going to come and discuss this need. And then after we hear from this beautiful roundtable of leaders, we'll have some questions from impacted leaders, poor and low-income leaders from the states of the Poor People's Campaign that are organizing, who have some of a challenge to put before this nation. I want to introduce the beautiful panel that we have here. We have Reverend Dr. Freddie Haynes, the senior pastor of Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, as well as the co-chair of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. We have Dr. Heidi Scherholtz, the president of the Economic Policy Institute. We have Dr. Sherelle Barber, the director of the Ubuntu Health Center on Racism, Global Movements, and Population Health Equity at Drexel's Dornsife School of Public Health. We have Fernando Garcia, the executive director of the Border Network for Human Rights. And we have attorney Caitlin Swain, a leading voting rights attorney and the co-director of Forward Justice. So I want to welcome all of you here. It's so powerful to be with this amazing group of leaders who are calling forth and building a third Reconstruction. And I want to kick it first to Reverend Dr. Haynes to start us off.
I thank you for.
There we go.
Okay. I said so much good stuff and you missed it. I'm sorry. No, very seriously. Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Liz, for your phenomenal leadership. You are a gift and you represent the best of the prophetic tradition. Of course, our hero is my frat brother, Reverend Dr. Bishop Barber. Thank you so much for being the conscience of this nation. This nation needs its conscience seared and fixed, and we thank God for your prophetic witness, boldness, courage, and your coalescing personality, always looking to bring us together as opposed to keeping us apart. So the question is, what time is it? And our response is, it's time for a third Reconstruction. What time is it? It's time for a third Reconstruction. After all, history has taught us that empires expedite their expiration date, not because of attacks from enemies on the outside, but because of internal injustice, institutional inequity, and iniquity. In a real sense, it's always a spiritual sickness that spells the death knell of any nation that does not recognize it has a moral responsibility. And so the question again is, what time is it? It's time for a third Reconstruction. Ezekiel, that great prophet, warns us with lessons from history when he says that Sodom, don't miss this, Sodom was sabotaged. Sodom came to an end because they oppressed the poor. Again, Ezekiel recognizes that morality in a real sense is something that is seen in the budgets that are produced. And oftentimes we talk about sin within, but we never deal with the sin we live in, according to the Reverend Jesse Lewis Jackson. And so in light of the fact that, as far as I am concerned, this Moral Monday movement, repairers of the breach, this is our last best hope. God is giving us a chance to get it right. And the only way we can get it right is to have a third Reconstruction, recognizing that Reconstruction can only take place when we use the tools that are moral, tools that are equitable, tools that reflect an ethic of justice. And so the question is, what time is it? I tell you what time it is. It's time to fight fascism. It's time to fight the big lie that has then morphed into policies of voter suppression throughout this country. It's time to fight fascism because the clock is ticking on the American empire. If we do not fight fascism, it's time, my sisters and brothers, to put our money where our mouth is. Jesus put it like this: where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. So if we are going to quote Dr. King in his last speech, be true to what we said on paper and be true to being a nation of liberty and justice for all, it must be reflected in our budgets, because budgets are moral statements. They make statements about the values of a nation, the values of a people. And so what time is it? It's time to fight fascism. What time is it? It's time to pass a budget where we put our money where our mouth is and reflect that we have a heart for those who are hurting, a heart for the least of these. After all, Jesus has already warned us in the judgment. He's going to judge nations by how we treat the least of these. And when he's talking about nations, evidently, Jesus is talking about policies and budgets. I was hungry. Did you feed me? Or will Jesus say instead, I was hungry, but you cut aid to dependent children. I was thirsty, and you contaminated water in poor Black, brown, and white communities. I was was in prison because of your criminal injustice system. I was a stranger, and you treated me as if I was a slave as you rode horseback in the mindset of the slave patrols. And this nation is going to say, Jesus, when did we do this? And Jesus will say, in as much as you did it to the least of these, you've done it also unto me. America, Martin King would say, may well go to hell if we don't get our budgetary priorities right and recognize that budgets are moral documents. But finally, it's time. I promise you it's time to engage in a restructuring of this nation. What does that mean? It means we get rid of a structure of hierarchy that advantages those who are advantaged and disadvantages those who are already disadvantaged. It's time for us to restructure this nation. We reconstruct this nation, because only when we restructure this nation will we indeed find ourselves building that beloved community, a community where justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream, a beloved community where all of us recognize the wisdom of the prophet Micah, who said, what does God require of you anyway but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God? Y'all, what time is it in this kairotic moment, in this kairos moment? It is game time, and game time means we've got to fight fascism. Game time means we've got to have budgets that reflect a morality that uplifts those who are down and out. And finally, it's game time, because we've got to restructure this nation so America can become the America that has always been promised for each and every one of us. I've just got one more question. What time is it? And the poet said, I have only just a minute, 60 seconds in it, forced upon me. I can't refuse it, didn't seek it, didn't choose it, but it's up to me to use it. I must suffer if I lose it, give account if I abuse it. Just a tiny little minute, but eternity is in it. What is he saying? It's time, and it's time right now. What time is it?
It's surely time for a third Reconstruction. Thank you so much for taking us to church in this town hall, Reverend Dr. Haynes. I'm going to now introduce and welcome Dr. Heidi Scherholz from the Economic Policy Institute and a leading economist in our nation. Thank you so much for everything you do and for being here.
Thank you so much. That's going to be a hard act to follow. I'll try to take you to the Economist Church, right? I want to talk very briefly about the fact that in order to usher in a new era of economic policy that would allow for shared economic growth and prosperity, one thing that we have to do is break the neoliberal consensus that has dominated the field of economics for decades. That neoliberal consensus is seeing a lot of cracks right now, and that's great, but we need to fully break it. And I'm a labor market economist, so I'll dig in on this a little bit by talking about how this plays out in my field. The heart of the neoliberal consensus in labor market economics is the idea that most labor markets are perfectly competitive. And to give you an idea of just how bonkers that is, I'm going to just go over some of the assumptions underlying economists' models of perfect competition. The key one is that employers don't have the power to pay workers any less than the full value of their work to the firm. In other words, employers do not have the power to keep any of the fruits of workers' labor for themselves. Further, perfect competition assumes that if a worker is paid less than what their work is worth to their firm, they will be able to immediately quit and find another job where they are paid what they're worth. And if the employer that paid them less than what they are worth doesn't start paying their workers fairly, they will go out of business. This does not reflect any reality, particularly not for low-wage workers and their employers. And so, well, one thing that I think is important to say here is I don't think any economist believes that those things are literally true. but most economists think that they are a tolerable enough approximation to reality that they're actually fine having those assumptions underlie how they think about the labor market. And this deeply matters. Think about the minimum wage. You know how everyone claims that economics says that if you increase the minimum wage, it will cause job loss? That idea is based on those assumptions of perfect competition. It assumes that workers are all being paid exactly what their work is worth. We know that that is wrong, especially in the low-wage labor market, which is why it is absolutely no surprise that empirical studies find that when you raise the minimum wage, workers see higher wages without significant job loss. But every time someone tries to raise the minimum wage or pass policies that boost unionization, the neoliberal lies that it will cause job loss get trotted out, and that often leads to the defeat of the policy. And one thing this points to is that historically, economists, with their bonkers models of perfect competition, have been totally complicit in providing justification for the idea that anything that provides workers power, like the minimum wage, like unions, will cost jobs. But as I said, that neoliberal consensus is cracking. More and more economists are showing through their research that the playing field isn't balanced, that employers do have the power to suppress wages, that things like policies to maintain full employment, policies to strengthen labor standards like the minimum wage and their enforcement, policies to boost unionization, these are all crucial to halt and reverse the trends of the last 4 decades of rising inequality, a rising black-white wage gap, and wage stagnation for working people. This is a very important shift, but you know that the people who have been on the winning end of rising inequality over the last however many decades are fiercely resisting it. So I just want to say I'm thrilled to be a part of this effort to bring more attention to this desperate need for a third Reconstruction.
Thank you so much. It's amazing to have such a grouping of people, including the power of the Economic Policy Institute and all the work you do, bringing us forward with this idea that it's costing our society too much to have the low wages and the poverty and the inequality. And in fact, we need to be investing deeply, not in trickle down, but in bottom up. I'm next going to bring into the conversation from a public health perspective, Dr. Sherelle Barber from the Ubuntu Center on Racism, Global Movements, and Population Health Equity. Thank you so much for all the work you do and for being with us this evening.
Thank you so much, Reverend Liz. It is truly an honor, as always, to be with the Poor People's Campaign and to really, join this, panel of folks who are talking about these issues. I actually want us to sit with the number that some of you all have evoked over this past few minutes in the hall, and that is that as of the end or middle of September, our country reached 700,000 deaths due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I actually want us to sit with that for a bit, because we know that those 700,000 deaths, so many of them were avoidable. So many of them were unjust, because we saw the disproportionate impact in Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and poor communities, right? And the pandemic really exposed the deep cracks that existed in so much of our society, right? From housing to healthcare, right? And so 700,000 deaths and counting. 1 in 500 Americans, deaths that surpassed the influenza epidemic of 1918. And I think the moral question before us, and one I've been asking as a public health scholar, as a social epidemiologist, whose job description is to count death is what do we do with those deaths? What do we do in this last 18 months where we've literally lost over 700,000 people to a virus, many of which could have been preventable? What do we do? And many of us in the public health field, especially those of us who have been committed to justice, committed to health equity, and advancing population health equity, really see movements like the Poor People's Campaign as the answer to the problems that ail us as a nation. And the questions before us, as Dr. Haynes alluded to earlier, are really questions of our shared humanity. The fact that we can allow 700,000 people to die, that 700,000 mamas and daddies and aunties and uncles and community members and activists and folks who have lost their lives, we can allow that number to happen and we don't even flinch as a nation. Says something about our own humanity, right? So that's the first point that I want to make. The second point that I want to make is that all of the policies that the Poor People's Campaign agenda is pushing forward, this really powerful calling for living wages, calling for adequate housing, calling for universal health care, all of those policies impact lives, right? And they literally say who is able to live, and not just live, but to thrive, right? And so all of what the Poor People's Campaign is pushing for in this moment is really critical, is if we're really going to be a healthy and a thriving nation, and if all communities are able to be healthy and to thrive. One of the most powerful statements that you all have within this movement is that everybody has a right to live. Everybody has a right to live. And that is the fundamental problem of public health. We should be advancing the things that give people the right to live. And I think this is so critical in this moment. And so really the question is, in the middle of a pandemic, if we literally choose the trajectory, the continued trajectory of death, what does that say about us as a nation? Because this moment is actually waking us up and calling us to a new way. Because as the representative said earlier, normal was killing us. Normal was killing us. Let me give you an example of that. In the city of Philadelphia, where I live, before the pandemic, life expectancy differences between some of the poorest, blackest, most disinvested communities and the wealthiest white communities was upwards of 20 years. A 20-year life expectancy difference between places that were mere miles apart, right? That was happening prior to the pandemic. We also know that there were inadequacies in access to healthcare in our urban centers, in our rural areas. That was happening prior to the pandemic. We also know that that so many people lack health insurance and that we still have those serious problems. That was happening prior to the pandemic. And so it really is upon us to really wrestle with these issues, to understand that health is inextricably linked to all of the policies that the Poor People's Campaign is calling for. And a final point, I'll invoke the words of Fannie Lou Hamer, one of my favorite organizers and ancestors from the past. She said, "I am sick and tired of being sick and tired." And that's where we are as a nation. There's so many people who are sick and tired of being sick and tired. And it is our moral responsibility. It is because of our shared humanity that we need to be passing the policies that are outlined by the Poor People's Campaign in this moment. Because again, everybody has the right to live. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barber. Indeed, everybody does, and that's why we are organizing and mobilizing together. I want to bring next Fernando Garcia from the Border Network for Human Rights to bring a perspective from the border, from a longtime activist and advocate about why it is the time for a third Reconstruction. Thank you so much for being with us, Fernando.
Thank you so much, Reverend Joe Harris. Again, thank you for this invitation to this extraordinary panel.
Also, thank you, Reverend Barber, for his leadership. I need to recognize one thing from the get-go is that in the Poor People's Campaign, immigrant communities and refugees are included fully. Since the beginning, we were part of the process. We're still part of this process. We're still part of this movement, and it is true. The answer, it is precisely that. That is the time for the third Reconstruction. But also in this Reconstruction, it's very important to recognize the contribution that immigrants and refugee communities are doing in this struggle. Because the struggle of immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers today in the United States is about fighting oppression, fighting criminalization, fighting militarization, especially at the US-Mexico border. I will say it before, the border has become the nation, but not in a good way. Today, the struggle of immigrant and refugees in this country and the struggle for the third Reconstruction means to be included with rights and with dignity, with a decent and livable wage, dignified housing, health care, political participation, justice, peace, and yes, a better future for our families. A huge part of this struggle for a third Reconstruction, it is indeed about 11 million undocumented Americans that live in the shadows, exploited, persecuted. We need to bring these undocumented Americans to the forefront of our struggle. They are part of our struggle. The third Reconstruction is also about creating a welcoming border, a border that reflects the best of our nation, not the worst. A border that makes Border Patrol and other border institutions accountable to communities and to human rights. Yes, it is time for the third Reconstruction, and we're going to be part of it, immigrants and refugees across the country. But it's not going to come by itself, and we recognize the challenge. Yes, it is about calling it. Yes, it is the time for a third Reconstruction, but we need to organize. We need to organize, and we need to do more organizing because it will not come by itself. So this is a crucial moment for our nation, where the future of our nation is at stake. How America would look like in 50 years. It's going to be a country with walls that put children in cages, that persecute immigrants, or finally it's going to be a country that accepts that immigrants have built this country in the past, are the essential workers of today's economy, and they're going to be part of the future. Yes, it is time for a third Reconstruction, and we will win it. We will do anything, whatever is possible, and we will fight with you, with everybody at the Poor People Campaign. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fernando. Indeed, we have to organize, 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 and that's exactly what this campaign, this movement is doing in states across the country. We have one final speaker before we get to some questions from such leaders that are organizing across the country. I want to welcome and give great appreciation for Attorney Caitlin Swain, a leading voting rights attorney who's winning as we speak, and the co-director of Forward Justice. Caitlin, thanks for the work you do and for being here with us.
Thank you so much, Reverend Liz, and to this incredible panel. Good evening to you all. My name is Caitlin Swain. I'm the co-director of Forward Justice based in North Carolina, and I am so proud to serve as legal counsel and strategic partner to this powerful campaign, and to join you today as a voting rights lawyer and advocate for a just democracy accountable to its people. As Ms. Sharon Levine of Rise St. James reminded us over the weekend, as she fights for a just recovery right now in the wake of Hurricane Ida, we need a democracy that can no longer exist comfortably with policy-created sacrifice zones, policy-created sacrificed people, sacrificed children, poisoned lands, policy-created poverty, policy-created avoidable death, as Sherelle Barber just spoke of. This campaign is shining a light on the direct line of accountability between moral policy demands and the demonstrated strength of an activated, multiracial, low-income electoral force in this country that is demanding change for better lives. A thriving, moral, just, constitutionally consistent policy through the third Reconstruction agenda. This campaign is reminding me that the law and the policies that govern our lives belong to the people, not to any one politician or any one party. And this campaign at the same time is shining a light on the grave threats to our democracy. The laws proposed and passed nationwide, state by state, targeting the power of voters who have stood up to express their vote in the face of the greatest obstacles: race-based voter suppression, violent efforts to destabilize and overthrow the will of American voters. But the message that we bring tonight as a part of this third Reconstruction agenda and analysis is that we are in a moment of opportunity, an opportunity for an investment in the infrastructure necessary to release the ambitions of a third Reconstruction abolition democracy agenda, a free democracy, a just democracy, able to unleash moral policy that can lift the load of poverty, reckon with the violence of systemic racism, embrace the end of systems of criminalization and crimmigration that deny the humanity of our families, our neighbors, and deny the lifeblood to this democracy, that impoverishes this democracy by prioritizing money, corporate interests, and fear over the dreams and the insights and the needs and priorities of the people who are living today, fighting to make real the promise of democracy's dream here in the United States. And there is an immediate window of opportunity for federal action that I want to emphasize tonight, this week and in the weeks ahead, necessary but not sufficient to achieve the project of a third Reconstruction democracy. That opportunity is why this campaign has led a powerful season of nonviolent direct action, calling for the immediate restoration and expansion of the Voting Rights Act, fair wages, immigration justice, and a unified right to vote bill for this country that sets federal standards to ensure access to the fundamental right to vote. Your right to vote should not be defined by what state you live in when you go to vote for your president. We know we must expand who American democracy includes in the we of we the people. We know we must lift barriers to access the right to vote, change the agenda, change the voices, and end exclusions based on race and income status, including, as this campaign has demanded, standing with formerly incarcerated peoples to eliminate all felony-based disenfranchisement schemes across this country, which we know have their origins and design and impact in white supremacist political projects to restrict the access to the right to vote. We know that we are in a great, truly generationally consequential threat of the continuation of an impoverished, violent democracy deprived of the voices, votes, and representations of its people. State by state, we are fighting against hundreds of legislative efforts to suppress and oppress, which we know firsthand about here in North Carolina, the testing ground for one of the first and worst voter suppression laws in the country after the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, and relentless attacks since that the Poor People's Campaign and the Forward Together movement rose up against and won time and time again. We know that when we unite together, we win. A filibuster cannot stand in the way of the people, and an enfranchised America is coming. I will end there and just say I'm so grateful to be a part of this movement and so grateful to be here with you all as we fight for the democracy that we all deserve.
Amen, amen, amen. We want to thank everybody that's joining us online, the thousands and thousands of folks that are all across this country. This has been a powerful conversation before already, and we're getting ready to bring some of the real heroes and heroines of our nation into the conversation now. Just want to do a little framing. We have 8 folks that are going to ask questions. 2 of those questions are, including this first one, are to any of our panelists. So be thinking about whether you want to respond, but we're going to do this really quickly. And so we only have 1 or 2 minutes to respond. Then there's other questions that will be, more around the expertise that our panelists come from. But so I first, without further ado, want to bring on Jade Mazzone out of Illinois. Welcome to this powerful town hall, Jade, and thank you for the organizing work you're doing in Illinois.
Thank you, Reverend Liz. Hello, everybody. My name is Jade Mazzone. I'm a lifelong resident of the South Beach side of Chicago, which is the only legally ward zone for hazardous waste materials and residential use. So that means that homes, schools, and parks are literally across the street from toxins and particulates that have been stored and released in our air, water, and soil for generations. I'm an Illinois ambassador for the Poor People's Campaign, a co-founder and mentor for the Rebel Bells Collective. And I'm also a part of the Stop General Iron campaign, where we just stopped the development of a metal shredding factory that would have further polluted our community. I'm very proud of what we've accomplished, but in truth, it was a battle that we never should have had to fight. All over the country, we are seeing the signs of climate and ecology in crisis, from soaring temperatures to droughts, fires, and superstorms. Instead of treating these crises with the urgency and seriousness that they deserve, our government continues to enable fossil fuel industry and other harmful industrial practices, all of which disproportionately impact poor people and communities of color. We're seeing this right now in the negotiations over the infrastructure bill, and I fear that the environmental and climate policies that we need will be cut out. So my question is, what action will you take to ensure that we do not compromise on the future of poor and low-income communities and on the very health of our planet?
So Jade, thanks for that powerful question, and I really do put it out to this amazing panel of leaders. What is the charge, both that we've heard from Jade and that we know ourselves in resisting this ecological devastation and coming forward with both policies that can change life for the better for everyone?
Let me just thank Jade for not just the question, but especially the work that you were doing. We've had similar fights in Dallas. We literally fought against what is known as Shingle Mountain. It was 10 stories, several tons of shingles that they placed as a landfill right next to a poor Black and brown neighborhood. And we took our influence there, camped out there until the city finally saw the need to remove the mountain. Our next fight now, of course, is to ensure that we get rid of the zoning policies that allow for those kinds of landfills to target certain communities. That means our charge, Jade, is to show up at those spaces, and it's powerful when we have clergy and impacted persons and attorneys all coming together. And that's what we did in Dallas. And so I think that's the charge for all of us, to show up in those spaces, show up in Cancer Alley, show up in those spaces where, as Bishop Barber says, we have what? We can get unleaded fuel, but we have leaded water. We've got to show up in those spaces and put the spotlight on it and help this nation to see morally, as the wind blows, the same toxins that you target for poor communities, the wind is going to blow them into your community.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I think I'll just add to that, that another piece of this is bringing the data. So we know data historically have shown that this is not just a Chicago issue. It's not a Philadelphia issue or a Houston issue. It is a systematic issue across the country. And so we do need the federal legislation to actually move forward and to hold industry accountable, these extractive, polluting industries accountable for the harm that they're causing individuals and whole communities, right? So we've seen the higher rates of cancer, the higher rates of asthma, and the higher rates of all of these health outcomes. There's data to show it. And we need to be coupling that data with these very powerful stories of communities who not only endured these harms, but also have been on the front lines of combating these issues. And especially as we are entering into this climate crisis, one thing I'll say is that we can't do climate adaptation on the backs of the most marginalized communities who have been most impacted by environmental racism, right? And so we can't say, well, we can't displace whole communities in places that, in an effort to kind of adapt to the climate crisis. We have to make sure that those communities who have been left out and who have been harmed are not sacrificed in this as we're experiencing the climate crisis. And so that's really important that we bring these issues to bear in this moment.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I'm going to have us move to our next question just so we keep it moving. But thank you again, Jade, for the work and everybody for your presence. I'm going to now introduce Emily Johnson out of Mississippi. Emily, thank you so much for joining us. And I think the question that you have might be directed to Heidi Sherholtz, just so everyone's on deck.
All right. Good evening, everybody. My name is Emily Johnson. I am a native of Mississippi. I'm here today as a low-wage essential worker, a formerly incarcerated convicted felon, and also I'm a survivor of sex trafficking. And I also I'm an addict living in long-term recovery. I'm a mother of 4. I work 2 jobs to make ends meet. I just want to say that in Mississippi, or I'd like to say to Congress that poverty, racism, low wages, voting rights, lack of health care, and exploitation does not have a color or a party. Been faced with many challenges in my life due to the broken system in the state of Mississippi that has a long history of punishing the poor while rewarding the elite wealthy class. I'm sorry, I lost my spot. Mississippi basically prides itself on exploitation of its people. And I'm here to tell Congress that we can no longer rely on states such as Mississippi. We just abolished slavery in Mississippi in 2013. Mississippi has shown this country far too many times that doing the right thing is not an option. We need laws changed on a federal level. I'm a low-wage and essential worker, and I need Congress to address the issue of low-wage and essential workers and invest in my fair chance because I deserve a chance as well. Okay.
I can jump in and make a quick comment. I just wanted to say thank you so much for your courage and sharing your story. It's incredibly important that we hear about this. And one of the things this brings up for me is this idea that I think people who have been on the winning end of rising inequality over the last 4 decades and beyond want us all to believe that what's been going on is just the natural outcome of a modern economy, and it's not something that we sort of could do anything about. That is totally false. What has happened, the things that you have, that have the lack of support that you got, those things are an absolute policy choice. This is the situation that we are in now is the result of deliberate policy choices that have shifted power away from regular people to, the rich and corporations, and that's a policy choice that we can change. We can make different choices. So chief among them are to get us a generous and effective support system for poor people and their families, to do things like pass policies to strengthen the minimum wage so people who are low-wage workers actually can make enough money at their jobs to make ends meet. Enforce minimum wage standards so unscrupulous employers aren't able to steal from workers even if there is a high minimum wage. Make sure we can pass laws so people who want to join a union are able to join a union, and on and on and on. Those are the kinds of things, those are the kinds of choices that we can make that could help just people across the board make it through very tough times.
Thank you so much for that reminder, Dr. Sherholtz, about how poverty wages, making essential workers expendable is a policy choice and not how it has to be. And thank you, Emily, for the powerful organizing work and coming forward work that you're doing. I'm going to bring up the next person to ask a question and to talk about the situation that is going on in Arizona. I introduce to you Joan Steed. Thanks so much for the work you're doing and for being with us today.
Thank you, Reverend Liz. Thank you for this opportunity. I am a 65-year-old woman who's been working approximately half her life as a healthcare worker and doing all types of home care, either for my family or publicly. And I'm very moved by the fact that I have an opportunity to speak towards the Build Better Back Act, because there is hope for my children, who are both caregivers here in Arizona, that they will someday get wages that are equal to the work they do. I appreciate for this opportunity. As a nurse, I've had a front row seat to the sorry state of public health in this country. Before the pandemic, as Senator Jayapal said, 87 million people were uninsured and underinsured, and our measures of health were worse than most developed countries. I feel when the pandemic hit, too many politicians celebrated healthcare workers like me with empty words while our patients were left defenseless. Instead of expanding healthcare, 119 rural hospitals and community health centers have closed in 41 states in America. Indian Health Services, that I have personally worked with, continues to be underfunded, and private insurance companies have made billions, B as in boy, billions of dollars, while over 700,000 American lives have been lost to the virus. But this reality does not reflect the will of the people. The majority of Americans support universal health care, and yet our democratic process seems to be built upon profits over the needs of American people. My question is, how can Congress fight for a moral vision of public health that puts people over profit? How does the health of democracy relate to the health of our communities?
Thank you so much for that really powerful question, and also for your work as a healthcare worker and a nurse during this time. I know it's been a challenge during this time, especially with the pandemic. And so I'll just touch on 3 points that I think are really, really critical in this moment. One, universal healthcare, it just has to be. like if we're in the pandemic, we've seen all this death, we've seen the fragmentation, the gaps, all of those things. We just need to have universal health care and move that forward, right? Because again, the lack of health care, the lack of quality health care for all Americans is killing us. And that is just so not necessary. And you talk about it, we had literally health insurance companies made $11 billion in profit in the second quarter of 2021, right? And we still can't tend to do the work to fix our fragmented healthcare system. So that's key. The second thing that, because we have to, as a public health person, I always think about health very comprehensively. We've got to invest in public health infrastructure. So what we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic was not just merely a healthcare systems issue, it was a public health infrastructure issue, which we have seen the disinvestment in public health agencies from the local, the state, and federal level over decades in this country. And that's been millions of dollars of underinvestment in public health infrastructure, which also has exacerbated the pandemic. And so not only do we need to be providing universal health care for everyone, we need to be investing in our public health infrastructure. But again, when that investment is not there, directly impacts and disproportionately impacts for communities and communities of color. And then finally, what I'll say is so much of health happens prior to the healthcare system encounter. And so again, we'll reiterate what I said earlier, all of the policies from living wages to housing to disinvesting from the war economy, all of those things will help us as a country, will improve the health of this nation, and particularly mitigate the health inequities that we see for so many health outcomes. And so it has to be the universal health coverage, the investments in public health infrastructure, as well as dealing with the structural drivers of health inequities that have caused so much devastation, both during the pandemic and prior to it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is a powerful conversation that we're having. Again, the solutions are at hand. The answers are here. And so that is indeed why it's time for a third Reconstruction. Our next question comes and is going to be directed at Reverend Dr. Haynes, is from Reverend Victoria Parker Mothershed out of Nebraska. Thanks so much for the work you're doing, Reverend Victoria, and for bringing your question to us this evening.
Thank you. Again, I'm Reverend Victoria Parker Mothershed. I'm born and raised in St. Louis. Through a single mom later on in life, I kind of grew up all over the city, but I spent my formative years in Ferguson, Missouri. I'm transitioning currently from Omaha, Nebraska to Leavenworth, Kansas, as I'm an itinerant elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So I got boxes everywhere, but I'm currently the theomusicologist at for the Nebraska PPC. And I currently, again, like I said, I'm serving in a congregation where some people are retired and some are doing well, some not so. However, I am also serving where there are a lot of young people, single parents, one who is facing eviction, so they're not. And in my religious tradition, I follow a homeless and undocumented man who preached the good news to the poor. Yet today, many in power have twisted our religious teachings and our most precious moral values. They say we live in a time of scarcity, even though we live in a time of incredible abundance. They take religious teachings out of their context to blame the poor for their poverty, and they use their distorted moral narratives to support policies of social and economic violence. But we know that there is enough to go around, and that building the society around these needs of the poor is not only possible, but it will benefit all of us. We know this because our research proves it, and because our most cherished religious texts tell us this, including the Bible. And Reverend Haynes, you said it. But my question is, how do we challenge the distorted moral narratives that we are up against and build our own moral visions for society? And what is the role of clergy, faith, and lay leaders in building a moral fusion movement to end poverty?
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh. Thank you so much, Reverend Parker Mothershed, for your amazing ministry, your clarity, your prophetic witness. And I think the answer is right there with the one you referred to, our Savior who hung out in the streets and was undocumented and majored in ministry to those on the margins. I think if we lift up the right Jesus as opposed to a Jesus that has been, in many instances, misused, misrepresented, misappropriated to be a part of power structures and empire. If we go back to just kicking it with Jesus and lifting up that Savior who again was born homeless under a genocidal policy from Herod, was undocumented and yet welcomed to Egypt, ministered on the margins in Nazareth, ministered to those on the margins in Nazareth. Not only that, but dispensed free health care to everyone who came to him, especially those with pre-existing conditions, and engaged in acts of civil disobedience, disrupting the status quo, disrupting structures that would devalue human beings. And so for me, it's recapturing that Jesus who has been kidnapped. And unfortunately, the Jesus that you are referencing, the Jesus I'm referencing, in too many instances has been victimized by identity theft. And we have a responsibility to retrieve his identity and lift up that true Savior who hung out in the streets. But also, I think the second part of your question is so powerful, and that is, for me, as we lift that Jesus up, then laypersons, preachers, elders, everyone recognizes I have a responsibility. This is my calling to walk in his footsteps. A few years ago, and y'all may be too young to remember this, there was this piece out that was so popular. What would Jesus do? What would Jesus do? I tell you what he would do. Jesus would be down for the poor. Jesus would be healing those who were sick. Jesus would be challenging systems of injustice, systems that oppress the impoverished and the poor. What would Jesus do? I'll simply give it to you like this. He announced it in his inaugural message. The Spirit of the Lord, the Holy Spirit is upon me because the Spirit has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. That's passing public policy. That's good news for poor people. Set the captives free. Heal those who are broken. Open the eyes of the blind. Deliver those who are downtrodden. And proclaim the year of Jubilee, the year of economic justice. If you down with Jesus, you down with that.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I'm about to win.
Thank you, right? We got it all figuring out tonight. This is amazing. So I'm going to move us to our next speaker. Our next question is going to come from Eva Bravo out of Pennsylvania. Eva speaks Spanish, and so we'll translate it here into English. For those that are watching, we're broadcasting this in Spanish as well, so the answers will be just broadcasted in English if you're watching this stream, and if you're watching the Spanish stream, you already know. So Eva, thanks so much for being here, and this is a question that Fernando Garcia will have.
Thank you so much. Buenas noches a todos. Mi nombre es Eva Bravo.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Eva Bravo.
Soy parte de Milpa.
I'm part of Milpa.
Yeah. El movimiento de líderes en Pensilvania.
Leaders of Pennsylvania, movement of leaders of Pennsylvania.
Y campaña de la gente pobre.
And a campaign for the poor people.
Soy promotora de Milpa en Delaware, en el condado de Delaware, Pensilvania.
I'm an activist in, I'm sorry, I missed the county. ¿Otra vez? ¿Cómo es el condado?
Ya, soy promotora en Milpa, en el condado de Delaware, Pensilvania.
Delaware, Pennsylvania. I'm sorry, I missed it.
Soy madre, abuela y trabajadora doméstica.
I'm a mother, a grandmother, and a domestic worker.
Quien está luchando por una reforma inmigratoria.
Who is working for my immigration reform.
para 11 millones de indocumentados en los Estados Unidos.
For 11 million undocumented workers in the United States.
Una reforma que la presidenta Carla Harris puede y debe incluir.
This is a reform that President Carla Hartford should include.
Yep. En la campaña de la gente pobre, creemos que el presupuesto.
We believe that this should be included in the budget.
Que se documenta, refleja la prioridad.
So budgets reflect people's priorities, a culture's priorities.
A la guerra, refleja tristemente que el presupuesto le da prioridad a la guerra, a la violencia por encima.
So currently our national budget prioritizes war and violence over other things.
Del presupuesto federal. Le da prioridad a la guerra y a la violencia de deportación de migración al bienestar de nuestra gente de cada año, a nuestra gente pobre de bajos recursos.
So the budget prioritizes war and violence and deporting people over caring for people.
Cada año gastamos el 53% de cada dólar en el Pentágono y tan solo el 15% en programas para mejorar nuestra vida de la gente social de bajos recursos.
Every year we spend 53% of every dollar on the Pentagon and on war, and only 15% of every dollar on programs that uplift and protect people of scarce resources.
En los últimos 20 años hemos gastado 21 billones de dólares.
In the last 20 years, we've spent $21 billion
en guerras infinitas, carcelamientos, detención y deportación de inmigrantes.
On endless wars and on detention and deportation of migrants.
Y en ejércitos, en poner ejércitos en la frontera, vigilancia, en muros.
And on putting armies on the border, putting up walls, and yes, on the border.
Y aún así, muchos miembros del Congreso afirman.
And even so, many members of Congress affirm
que es un gasto de 3.500 billones en nuestras comunidades.
That an expenditure of $3.5 billion on our communities
a lo largo de 10 años es excesivo.
Over 10 years, they consider that to be excessive.
Y que una reforma migratoria no debe de estar encima de la mesa.
And migratory reform should not be on the table.
Yo me pregunto.
And so I wonder.
¿Cómo se vería revertir los papeles? En vez de gastar en la guerra, gastarlos en nuestra comunidad.
What would it look like?
Recursos.
Well, what would it look like if we turned the tables and instead of spending money on war, we spent money on communities of low-income communities?
Y hacer programas para que la gente desde el fondo, desde abajo, suban con mejor vida, con dignidad, propiedad y con nuestro trabajo que es arduo y duro día con día.
What would it look like if we had programs that lifted up people at the bottom of the social ladder and gave them dignity and gave them their own property, gave them their own means of subsistence?
Y cruelmente el sistema migratorio hacia programas para elevar
So the current migratory system has programs.
En la campaña de la gente pobre nos gustaría afirmar una política moral y equitativamente una buena economía, que significa, me gustaría saber qué significa esto para ustedes.
So in the Poor People's Campaign, we are seeking justice in our economy and in our budgets, and I would like to know what that means to you.
Bueno, primero que nada, muchas gracias, Eva, por su trabajo, a toda su familia que está en esta lucha, a todos los promotores y a todos los líderes de MILPA y de otras organizaciones que están trabajando como usted. First, I want to say that Eva is bringing a number of points that are very important, not only for this campaign, but for especially immigrant communities. And I think she does a reflection on how this society can afford to spend billions and billions of dollars in militarizing, for example, in this case, the U.S.-Mexico border, to build border walls, to incarcerate children, to build detention centers, in how the society and this Congress and previous administration had not built anything that favors immigrants and refugees. How a new economy, a new budget, a moral budget would look like if things were different. And I would like to say to her that there's the Poor People's Campaign put together a budget, about the people's budget, that we have a solution for it. But also would like to say that I could imagine a border where instead of building detention centers and cages, we're building welcoming centers, where we recognize that immigrants and immigrant workers are an essential part of our society, in that immigration reform we have to consider the possibility, the third Reconstruction will have to consider the possibility that immigrant workers and refugees are part and will be part of our society in the future, that we cannot, the answer is not to spend $18 billion a year at the border just to go after families and children. So yes, I think the moral question is there. I think Eva mentioned also how come the Congress has not actually included immigration reform and in the reconciliation process. What I would like to say to Eva is that it's not going to happen by itself. Again, I mean, what we're talking about is about a movement, a radical movement, a moral movement that shakes the foundations of the society, not only trying to win somebody in Congress or trying to win a legislature or legislation. I think this movement entails to be in the streets, at the workplace, in the churches, and come together. So only then this movement will become real and the third reconstruction will happen. So quiero decirle una vez más que vamos a lograr la reforma migratoria, vamos a cambiar el paradigma de no gastar ese dinero en perseguir inmigrantes y gastarlo para elevar la calidad de vida de los migrantes, pero eso lo vamos a ganar en las calles, en los lugares de trabajo y en el trabajo organizativo que usted está haciendo. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
It's so great to be in this movement together with the amazing leaders who are coming forward with powerful questions and powerful solutions to all of these issues. We have a couple more questions. The next I want to bring up is Jasmine Krotkov out of Montana, whose question I think is going to be directed to Heidi Sherholtz as well again.
Good evening. My name is Jasmine Krotkov, and I live in central Montana. I retired early from my job as a postmaster, Now I work in a number of part-time, low-wage jobs, from hotel housekeeping to grooming the local cross-country ski area, all in order to make ends meet until I can retire for good. I joined the steering committee of the Montana Poor People's Campaign because my coworkers deserve better than they're getting. Poverty is often treated as a marginal issue in our country, in part because the federal poverty line hasn't been updated in over a half a century. In 2018, the Poor People's Campaign released the Audit of America, which found that 140 million people are poor or one financial emergency away from economic ruin, rather than the 40 million who were counted in the federal poverty measure. This failure to accurately measure poverty has had a major impact on how society understands who is poor in America. It has also had a big impact on how much money is directed to social safety net and welfare programs, and on who is allowed to access life-saving programs like TANF, the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, and the CTC, the Child Tax Credit. Near the end of his life, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said that the prescription for the cure rests with an accurate diagnosis of the disease. So my question is, how do we ensure that our nation accurately diagnoses the crisis of poverty today? With that in mind, what would a new war on poverty need to look like today?
Thank you so much, Jasmine, for the organizing work you're doing. It sounds incredible and incredibly important. You're totally right. The failure to measure poverty accurately is a really core problem, and actually the fight against poverty. Another thing, in addition to the things that you mentioned, another thing that it does is it gives us false messages about what we need to do to fight poverty. And so, like in 2020, we just got numbers out in August or September about poverty rates in 2020. And they showed, using the official poverty measure, that poverty went up in 2020, which was no surprise because of the pandemic. But we also know that Congress actually made huge, put in huge policies, stimulus payments, increased unemployment insurance payments in order to fight poverty during the recession. And our official poverty measures don't take all of those things into account. If you look at the supplemental poverty measures, different policy poverty measures that do, they actually showed that poverty went down in 2020. And I only say that not to suggest at all that we are in a good place on poverty, but to say, if you didn't have a good measurement of poverty, if we didn't have these alternative measurements, we wouldn't have a good sense that those things that Congress did actually made a huge difference to people's living standards during the recession. So it just underscores exactly what you said about the need to it's so crucial that we measure these things effectively. And then in order to fight poverty, I think of this on two tracks. We need a strong and generous support system for poor people and families. One important thing about that is it is absolutely crucial that that support system does not have work requirements. So one of the things that's being discussed right now is in the Reconciliation Act, in the Build Back Better, is whether to extend the temporary expansions of the child tax credits that Congress passed as pandemic relief. Those expansions of the child tax credit cut child poverty in half. And a key reason it did that is because families could get that child tax credit even if they didn't work, which means in the pandemic, we put something through that said, we are choosing at this point not to hold children's benefits hostage to their parents being able to get a job. We made that choice. It cut child poverty in half. We could make the choice now to actually continue that policy. So that's one really key thing. And then the other thing is that is super important. We need to pass policies to make sure jobs are good jobs. A huge swath of poor people work. Many work full time, but their jobs just aren't good enough to pull them, their families out of poverty. So things like making sure that we put in place policies to get to full employment, making sure we have very strong minimum wages and good enforcement of those minimum wages, making sure we pass policies to strengthen people's ability people who want to be in a union, strengthen their ability to actually be in a union. Those are the kinds of things, that whole suite of things is also an incredibly important part of the fight against poverty.
Well, thank you so much for raising, these issues, and for the fact that, in the agenda of the Poor People's Campaign, we have updating the poverty measure, because we think it's an important demand. It's an important part of our agenda, because again, we have to be able to aggregate and disaggregate who is poor and why people are poor in order to come forward with these solutions. We have 2 more questions left, and I'm really excited about them. The next question is one that any of our panelists can answer again. And as we're getting closer to the end of the hour, hoping that we can answer these questions accurately but also briefly. The next question is from Marcy Mackinnon out of Maine. Marcy, thanks for being here, and thanks for the powerful work you're doing in Maine. And all of us as panelists, let's be ready to answer hers.
Thank you, Reverend Liz. Good evening. My name is Marcy. I was born and raised in a small fishing village on the coast of Maine, and I currently live in Portland, Maine, raising my son as a single Black mother in the second whitest state in the country. Before the pandemic, there were between 9 and 11 million people who were homeless or living in the revolving door of streets, shelters, cars, and even in tripled and quadrupled up apartments. Now we are facing an eviction and foreclosure crisis that threatens to leave millions of people with nowhere to live. All of this is happening in the richest country to ever exist, where there are more abandoned luxury homes than homeless people, and where we can produce a prefab house in less than 45 minutes. From your perspective, how do we ensure that housing is a human right instead of a private commodity? Rather than just expanding the shelter system, how do we guarantee housing for all in a current economy that rewards the rich and allows millions to face evictions, rising debt, and homelessness?
Thank you again so much for that question, Marcy, and I would ask if anyone has an adequate response to that difficult question.
Well, Marcy has just asked us all to listen to what is a clear call that housing is a human right instead of a private commodity. How do we guarantee housing for all? And this is a part of the agenda of the Poor People's Campaign, and it's a part of the agenda that has been rising up during this pandemic that Congress has been forced to listen to, because as Sherelle Barber said earlier, it's not something that is happening just in one neighborhood or another neighborhood. It is happening across this country because it's structurally created. So what I hear from this, what I hear from Marcy, is that the people in this campaign who are risking so much to rise up to vote in historic numbers in this federal election and in the special election in the shadow of a global pandemic and violence are asking for this democracy and their representatives to listen and rise up to meet the bar set by people like Marcy and Ava and Emily and Miss Joan Steed and Jasmine and all those who have spoken tonight. The genius, goodness, resilience, compassion, and commitment of the American people to build a world that's better and worthy of our hopes for our children, where housing is a human right, where we turn the table and instead of spending money on war, we spend money in our budget to lift the load of poverty, to redress systemic racism and enact a just economy, and where we make, what and who has been historically sacrificed the center of the agenda. And that's what I feel so inspired about those who are listening to this campaign, the caucus members who are holding the line to stand with not just the moral center of this country, but as Marcy is saying, with the ambitions of what is possible when we listen. So I'm just grateful for you to call into being what it is that we know is right, that housing should be a human right, and that it should be at the center of our agenda. And I'm grateful to you.
Thank you so much.
One or two more points to that, if you don't mind. So a couple of things, because that was a really appreciate that response, Caitlin. And just to know that nowhere in this country that anyone living on a minimum wage can afford housing, right? That's a problem, right? That the affordability of housing is just so out of reach for so many people who are working. And then to try it back to health, one thing that we saw with the pandemic is that the eviction prevention policies actually reduced pandemic deaths, right? And so housing is, and the security of housing and secure housing is directly influences health. And we see that even with the pandemic. And so again, just want to reiterate that we have evidence of why this is so important for so many different reasons.
Thank you so much to everybody. I want to bring up our final person who's asking a question. I introduce to you Kaylin Barker out of West Virginia. Kaylin, thanks for the work you're doing. Thanks for being here, and thanks for coming forward with us this evening.
Thank you for having me. Like she said, my name is Kaylin Barker. I'm a wife, mother, and 9th generation West Virginian. I live in one of the poorest and sickest states in the country, and like millions of other Americans, I struggle to make ends meet. Even with a master's degree, I scrounge up couch pennies just to put gas in my car. As a poor person and ally, I'm disheartened and angered by the constant attack on voting rights in this country. Voting rights experts say that we are in the middle of the greatest attack on voting rights since Reconstruction after the Civil War. Since the 2020 elections, 43 states have introduced over 250 new bills that further disenfranchise voters, limit mail-in voting, restrict early voting and voting hours, purge voter rolls, and more. These laws target the poor and people of color across this country. And on the federal level, we have fewer voting rights today than we did after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, especially since both Republican and Democratic senators continue to block legislation that would protect and expand our democracy. The Poor People's Campaign just released a report that shows the impact poor and low-income people had on the 2020 election, and concludes that the poor are a sleeping giant that could transform elections for a generation. How do we awaken this sleeping giant, especially in the face of attacks on our voting rights? And what will it take to build a democracy where every person's voice and vote are respected?
Caitlin, are you able to take that question?
Absolutely. I think you've said it better than I could say it, which is we are in the midst of an extreme threat to our democracy, but there is so much hope. There is so much hope right now. And it's not just about the sleeping giant of who can be awakened. It's about who is already awake in this country and is already expressing our voices, saying that we know that change is possible. We are in a window of opportunity. And it is a short window, I believe. I believe we are within weeks. And as you speak to us from West Virginia, you know the importance of the power that you have been bringing in West Virginia, lifting up and saying, listen to the people, senators, listen to the people rising up and saying, we want a democracy that includes us all, a democracy that has Election Day as a holiday, that guarantees same-day registration, early voting, that guarantees automatic voter registration, that allows for rights restoration when you return to community after you have served your time, that does not exclude people based on their income status, that allows for people to be able to have access to mail-in voting, if that is the way to be able to get access to your fundamental right to vote, that guarantees DC statehood. We know this is possible. We know it is possible to restore the Voting Rights Act, not just to the power that it had before it was stripped away and gutted in Shelby County, but strengthen it to ensure that in this nation, we are not having to spend our resources and time, the same people who have been attacked and targeted by the laws of voter suppression, spending our time and resources again and again just to get access to the right to vote. We should not have to be in those fights now. As Rosanelle Eaton, the mother of the movement in North Carolina, reminded me, she said, it is like Fannie Lou Hamer, we're tired, we're sick and tired. But she said, I'm fired up and I'm fed up. We have a job to do right now, and we can guarantee a democracy that expresses the will of its people, because it does not place barriers in the path of its people to be able to express our voices and our dreams for what is possible. So I believe that is the course that we are on, that the people are calling for it with a united voice in this nation, and that Congress is going to hear those people. Because if Congress cannot hear those people in this time, it will be to the peril of this country for generations to come. And I believe that truth is coming out in part because of people like you who have been lifting up, using your time and your energy to remind us all of what is at stake.
Thank you so much to Caitlin for that beautiful answer, Kaylin for the beautiful question, and everyone that's been with us so far this evening. This town hall shows why we need these powerful leaders coming all across the country together and organizing ourselves into compelling power. The next piece before we leave is a statement from Representative Barbara Lee, who is on a plane right now because there are votes going on, and had to send her message through video. So we welcome and appreciate Representative Lee for the fights that she's making and for that introduction that she did of the third Reconstruction resolution. So we're having a little bit of technical difficulties, so we're going to try to figure out hearing this video and playing it. But I think, again, I want to summarize a little bit of what we've been doing this evening. We heard a powerful call in this moment when Congress is debating really the fate of our infrastructure, the infrastructure of our democracy, the infrastructure of our daily lives, the infrastructure of roads and bridges, at a time when we have the possibility, because we have the resources, not to go back to normal. Normal was killing people, but to move forward together and into a bold and visionary set of policies that could lift from the bottom so that everybody could rise. And we know that we won't just get there by waiting for anyone to save us. We heard that loud and clear throughout this evening. And that is why we in the Poor People's Campaign organized a powerful season of action this summer. We've been organizing in communities across the country all for years and years now. And why we are in the moment calling for a powerful, generationally transformative declaration, a mass poor people and low-wage workers assembly, a moral march on Washington that will take place in June. This is what we know that we need to do. We're calling everybody to be able to be a part of that. So we're going to hear from Barbara Lee, and then we're going to get our charge to get organized, to keep on organizing, and to move forward together.
Thank you, Bishop Barbara, Reverend Theo Harris, and all of you here with the Poor People's Campaign for this great event. Bishop Barbara, Reverend Theo Harris, and the Poor People's Campaign are the voice for millions of people from every part of our country, of every background, people who are coming together and demanding that we do what we can and what we must do, and that's end poverty in this nation. I'm so glad to be participating alongside so many impactful public health experts, faith leaders, economists, and advocates, and of course my good friend and a great leader, the leader of our Progressive Caucus, Congresswoman, Chairwoman, Pramila Jayapal. This town hall has been all about what it will take for us to alleviate poverty for the 140 million people in America living paycheck to paycheck. It's time for us to create a third Reconstruction to allow everyone an equal opportunity at the American dream. The challenges of the last year have clearly illustrated how close 140 million people living in low wealth are one emergency away from economic ruin. It is unforgivable that 250,000 people die each year due to poverty and inequality alone. It's a moral abomination that alongside mounting poverty, low wealth, debt, and economic desperation, poor communities and poor communities of color are hit first and worse by so many life-threatening challenges. We know that systemic racism is embedded in our laws and policies, which create and deepen inequalities in health, economic security, education, housing, employment, immigration, voting rights, and so much more. Drawing on the transformational history of the first Reconstruction after the Civil War and the second Reconstruction of the civil rights struggles in the 20th century, this moment demands a third Reconstruction to revive our political commitment to implement moral laws and policies that can heal and transform this nation. We now stand at a tipping point. We must seize this moment as Congress debates the Build Back Better agenda, a once-in-a-generation transformational investment in fighting poverty and rebuilding our economy from the ground up. These are attainable goals. You know that. We just need the political will to seize the moment, and we need your help to do it. Thank you for all that you do each and every day. Your work is so crucial as we fight to pass the Build Back Better agenda and make investments in the people first. Thank you so much for having me speak with you for a few minutes today. Let us keep up the fight.
We welcome you to the launch of the Mass Poor People's Low Wage Assembly and Moral March on Washington, D.C., June 18, 2022. We are a new, unsettling force, and we are powerful.
To demonstrate the compelling power that we, poor and low-income people, have to reconstruct society from the bottom up.
And we need to do it with the loudest voices possible, the biggest actions possible.
Because we know that there is no scarcity in this land. The only scarcity is the moral will to do what's right.
We are those with sub-minimum wage jobs who can't afford sky-high rent.
People with disabilities are the fastest growing minority group.
It's crazy to me that in 2021, it's still legal for workplaces to pay a sub-minimum wage to people with disabilities.
There are still so much trial and tribulations that we go through as Indigenous people. We can't get a decent wage to sustain ourselves, nor can we get adequate housing.
Veterans across this nation say enough is enough. We can't pat essential workers on the back on one day and then cut their health care the next day.
Health is a political choice.
What more do I need to do to prove that my voice is just as valuable as anyone else's?
There are still forces in denial that would try to slow walk our transition to a clean economy and a just future for us all.
We have an immoral system run by immoral people.
But together we walk and we fight.
It's time for a change. Reconstruyamos esta gran nación.
See, we are people of resilience. As we fight these interlocking injustices together,
when we work together, mobilize together, and rise together, we become a voice for the voiceless, and we become an agent of change in a time where great change is needed.
We need the third Reconstruction to ensure that deaf people, people with disabilities, and all people can have the right to live and to thrive.
We know what they are doing, but the question is, what are we going to do? Reconstruction begins when we change our mentality and say it's time for you to get your foot off of my neck.
That just gives me chills. Are you ready for justice to come soon and for this third Reconstruction? I want to thank everybody that has been with us this evening for this powerful national town hall. I want to thank Representative Jayapal and Dr. Barber. I want to thank Reverend Dr. Haynes and Heidi Sherholtz. I want to thank Dr. Sherelle Barber and Fernando Garcia. I want to thank Attorney Caitlin Swain. And I want to thank the powerful leaders from our states, Jade Mazzone, Emily Johnson, Joan Steed, Reverend Victoria Parker Mothershed, Ava Bravo, Jasmine Krotkoff, Marcy Makinen, and Kaylin Barker. Thank you so much. And I want us to now come off video and do what we do at all Poor People's Campaign events. We remind people that we're going to move forward together and not one step back, because we are getting in step, we're getting ready, we're going to organize and mobilize and register and educate and engage millions of people across this nation. And we're going to come forward with compelling power on June 18th for a mass poor people, low-wage workers assembly and moral march on Washington. So let us sing ourselves, chant ourselves, sign ourselves off by saying forward together.
Forward together. Not
Forward
one
together.
Step back.
Forward together. Not one step back.
Forward together, not one step back.
Forward together.
Not one step back.
Not one step back. Forward together.
Not one step back.
Prayers and blessings to everyone.
Vaya con Dios.
Vaya con Dios.
God bless you all.